So I know that in reference to my Abzan deck, I said that because it was an Abzan combo deck, it did not necessarily matter what the commander you chose was in order for the deck to be effective. And that is completely true. The deck is reliant on the 99, and as long as your commander is an Abzan commander, so that way you have access to white, black, and green, then you're pretty much good to go. That being said, not all commander cards are created equal. There are definitely some that each one does serve a purpose, each one does define a very specific gameplay strategy, and there are some that do fit my gameplay strategy with my Abzan deck more so than others do. So I wanted to create just a short tier list going over all of the non-partner Abzan commanders. Non-partner because just talking about partners is very convoluted, and it's just going to add more unnecessary time to the video, especially when easily like the S tier and A tier commanders are going to be the single card commanders to begin with. So yeah, there's no point in going over the partner cards. But that being said, just kind of doing what I want the deck to do. There are going to be some commanders that are better than others, and I just wanted to, create a basic tier list to go over that. So, starting off with the two top tiers, getting those out of the way real quick because for one, if you want to use the deck to its fullest potential, you're going to be choosing one of these two, and you're not going to use anybody else. So there's really no point in going any further for your viewing purposes. So first, I would say currently, out of all the commanders that we have access to in Abzan, the absolute best commander for my combo deck is going to be Nethroi, Apex of Death. Nethroi is a 5/5 legendary Cat Nightmare Beast for 2 generic and white, black, green. Comes with Death Touch and Lifelink, pretty good stats on a 5/5, but more importantly, it has a mutate cost of 4 generic, Selesnya, black, black. And whenever this creature mutates, return any number of target creature cards with total power 10 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Sorry, it's not exactly the most high res image, and having a little bit of hard time reading it verbatim just from this. But basically, when you're able to mutate Nethroi, so there's just another creature on the battlefield, and like I mentioned in the previous deck tech video, Sylvan Caryatid, very good contender just because it's mostly a non-threatening card, but it also does have hexproof, so fairly hard to get rid of as long as you're just treating it like the land that it's really supposed to be. But if you mutate onto Sylvan Caryatid, because again, it's hexproof, not Shroud, all of a sudden that's when if any of your combo pieces are going straight into the graveyard, because this is a combo that does require typically 4 cards, and it is very heavily creature based. I did show a scenario when you can pull the combo off with just artifacts and enchantments, but I would say like 9 times out of 10, probably even more than that, 19 out of 20 times, you're going to be winning the game just through all creatures. So, knowing that, getting specific creatures out onto the battlefield, especially if you're running, especially, there are some cards that kind of tick people off, like Viscerous here, not that big of a deal. Good Fortune Unicorn or Renata, not that big of a deal. But if you play any of your Persist creatures, or if you play like your Zulaport Cutthroat or your Cruel Celebrant, people are going to know right off the bat you're a combo deck and you need those creatures in order to win. So people are going to remain confident in the notion that they can use spot removal in order to take out your piece one by one. So that way, as long as you don't have all 4 pieces of the puzzle out on the battlefield, they're good. Nethroi is the commander when you pull off the mutate effect that even if you're being resilient against the creature removal or board wipes that you have to go through, he's the one who can reset you and bring everything back just through the mutate. Because if you remember, persist creatures are typically 2/2, and that's the ideal power toughness ratio for persist creatures because if otherwise because when the persist happens they come back as 1/1s, and turning a 2/2 into a 1/1 is actually a fairly common thing among even like common cards. I guess it's more like a 1/1 into a 1/1, but something like Doomed Traveler, where when it dies you're creating a creature token. Replacing a body for a 1/1 body is a common thing. So with the persist creatures themselves, they only have power 2, which means with Nethroi, you have 8 more total power to play around with. And a lot of the other creatures in the deck, like the mono white Anafenza, a Kintree Spirit, that's just a 2/2. So if you play both the persist creature and Anafenza with that, then you have 6 more power to play with. And then just because everything is so low power within the deck, because you're focusing on the effects that the creatures have as opposed to their power and toughness, because you really don't care about combat damage, you can easily take all 4 pieces out of the graveyard from Nethroi's mutate, put them onto the battlefield, and then just explain the loop and win the game. So Nethroi is very explosive. He is your reset button against board wipes, and even multiple targeted removal, because again, you're going to be hated out of the game because you're a combo player. Nobody really likes the combo players, but Nethroi, like I keep saying, he's your reset button. Very valuable asset to have, and easily just takes the top spot as the ideal commander. The only other commander I would put in S tier, and I'm gonna rank these a little bit more. So, like, the next card's going right here to show that yeah, Nethroi is better than this one, but they're both in S tier because of how valuable they are. So whatever card is here is better than this card, 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 and so on. You get the idea. But the next commander that I would put in S tier would be Anafenza the Foremost. So, Anafenza the Foremost, just for white, black, green. So that's the first thing about Anafenza. There are only 2 other commanders in Abzan that have that low of a converted mana cost, and spoiler alert, they're actually kind of trash comparatively. But Anafenza, you're getting a 4/4 creature, which a 4/4 for 3 mana, that's value right then and there. But even outside of that, whenever Anafenza the Foremost attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on another target tapped creature you control. Technically, that can be useful. So if you do want to make use of that, you can attack with Anafenza, and you're not at too much of a risk of losing too much with swinging into a very formidable defense. Like, let's say you're swinging into somebody who would have a first strike death touch, and they block Anafenza, and Anafenza is absolutely going to die. To start off, she only costs 3 mana, so to bring her back, it's only going to be 5, and then to bring her back a second time, it's going to be 7. And that may sound like a lot up front, but also remember that we're playing green, and the deck tech did have quite a bit of ramp, not only just through land searching, but also a couple mana dorks and soul ring and so on and so forth. So getting 7 mana even by like turn 5, fairly common. It's you can risk Anafenza's ability to be on the battlefield a couple of times a game, and then because that ability triggers, if you absolutely needed to, you can put it on any of your persist creatures that all have a -1/-1 counter on it, And then I already explained how persist works in the previous video, so I'm not going to go into any more of that. But essentially, if there is a creature that did suffer from persist and it didn't have any way of removing the counter, Anafenza can technically do that. But we don't care about that so much. It's the second clause that really gets to us. If a creature card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. Anafenza is a fantastic quote unquote hate bear counter matchup against a lot of graveyard decks. Also notice that it says if a creature would be put into an opponent's graveyard. So this does not affect our ability for us to combo with persist, because we're the ones, like when our creatures die, they're going into our graveyards, not an opponent's graveyard. So, or at least, I don't believe there are any effects where it's like if one of our creatures dies, that it goes into an opponent's graveyard. I've never heard of anything like that. So if you absolutely needed to, if you knew that you were going against like a super reanimator deck, or I don't even know what else there would be, honestly. But yeah, again, because this card is only 3 mana. Now, yes, it does require one of each of the colors, but it's still only 3 mana, and it's very high probability, I would say, that you're consistently getting all of your colors very early on, so this really isn't even that big of a factor. For 3 mana, you're putting out a very resilient creature. It does have 4 toughness that has this hate bear effect. In some ways, you could even just treat it like an enchantment. If you knew you're going up against a Sidisi deck, then this, just having this as a threat, even in the command zone, there's a lot of value behind it. So Anafenza is absolutely going into S tier for that. She's not quite Nethroi level, but she is very high up there. Also, quick story time. I'm always gonna remember this victory because it was very like off the walls. I wasn't expecting it. But there was a game I was playing where this was before Nethroi was printed, and Anafenza was, absolutely the commander that I had. I was playing a game where I had a sacrifice outlet. I think it was Altered Dementia. And then I had Juniper Order Ranger on the battlefield. So, at that point, I had at least 5 mana. I'd hard cast it. People knew I was trying to set up for a combo, but I wasn't close enough, and they didn't feel threatened by what I was trying to do, that they kind of just left me alone. They let me keep my artifact, they let me keep my heavy creature. I knew right then and there that if I drew a persist creature, I would win the game. So I remember thinking to myself, okay, I just need a persist creature. Literally any persist creature would help. Please just get me one. And of course, I draw Wing Rattle Scarecrow. That's the one that only has persist as long as you control another black creature. My sacrifice outlet was an artifact, and Juniper Order Ranger is Selesnya. It doesn't have any black in it. So I felt a little bit frustrated at first, but I still had another land in my hand. So, to win the game, I played that land, so I had 6 mana. I used my colors to play Anafenza. Now I have a black creature on the field, and I used the last remaining 3 to play Wing Rattle Scarecrow, and I explained the loop and won the game from there. So if you do absolutely need to, just for Wing Rattle Scarecrow, you do have another 3 mana creature that does have black in it that is always available to you. That's really valuable. So yeah, just a fun story there. And yeah, so I think I've talked about enough about Anafenza. These 2 cards are, like, if you're, like I said, if you're willing to, or if you're wanting to win and that's your primary goal, you could choose between either of these. They're both, I would say, just as the marginal difference with Nethroi does not make Anafenza irrelevant. So, especially if you know in your game shop and your meta that you're up against a lot of graveyard hate, Anafenza is very viable. So moving forward, I'm not going to go in any particular order. I'm just going to kind of go over cards as they happen. So let's see. Kolfner, the Last U. Let me read this one real quick. It has Vigilance and Reach. It's a 3/7 for 3 generic, white, black, green. So 6 mana, 3/7 with Vigilance and Reach. That's not bad. When Kolfner, the Last U, or another creature you control dies, return up to one other target creature with lesser toughness from your graveyard to your hand. Okay, this one, this one isn't very good. So 6 mana for a 3/7 Vigilance Reach. We're gonna say that Vigilance doesn't matter because we're really not attacking with combat damage. So fundamentally, it's 6 mana 0/7. We can still call it 3/7. It's a 6 mana 7 toughness creature with reach. So the defense is nice. If you really need to spend 6 mana on defense, fundamentally, I think you have bigger problems with how you're playing the deck, but we'll skip over that part. The big thing about him, so again, 6 mana is super relevant, so you're getting him out late. And the thing about him is you're really, it's a conditional clause. You do kind of have control over this conditional trigger of when when a creature dies, because like we have a bunch of sacrifice outlets and we're the ones trying to trigger persist. So we can choose to make use of this ability as we see fit, but we're really not getting much out of it. It's hard to say. I just feel like he's too slow. And not only do you have to spend 6 mana just to get him out, but well, first off, he's completely useless if you don't have any other creatures in your graveyard. And there's a high possibility of that because I would rather spend 6 mana trying to win the game on the spot by casting 3 creatures all at once to line up with the other creature or artifact or enchantment or whatever that I already have to pull the combo off. And I know that requires a lot more luck of the draw, and that's unrealistic expectations, but 6 mana for something that's really slow and is just good defense, it doesn't strike me as impressive. So, Culvener, I'm going to put him in C tier. He's not completely useless. And one disclaimer I'm going to make about all these commanders, all of them are very good in their own right. Some of them do need to have decks built around them. Like in this particular tier list with the deck I'm making, I'm shoehorning these commanders just for the colors. And it really doesn't matter at the end of the day which commander you're using, but there are other decks where, and I'll describe it when I get to a controversial listing. There's a particular card I'm thinking of in, out of these commanders, and I'm going to put it a little bit lower than most people would like, but the reason for that is because while the commander itself is very good and fairly viable, I don't know, even potentially in this deck, you make the most out of it if you're building a deck around it. So, instead of being vague, why don't we just talk about it? Gave, Guru of Spores. This one's going to be fairly low. Let me read exactly what it is. Enters the battlefield with 5+1/+1 counters on it. So for 5 mana, 2 generic, white, black, green, it's a 5/5. Not bad. Pay 1 mana, remove +1/+1 counter from a creature you control, create a green sapperling creature token. Sacrifice a creature, or then pay 1, sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. I'm just trying to think how to word this. because I think you can control the stack that even with persist. Yeah, I think this card works with persist because so you pay one to sacrifice a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. I think you use that ability and put that on the stack, and then before that resolves, you have the persist. You stack it in such a way that the persist triggers are happening before then. So you pay one to sacrifice a creature, and before you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, the persist happens, so you're getting the creature with the -1/-1 counter, and then you put the +1/+1 counter on that, and then as long as you have the mana for it, you do have to pay one mana each time you do this, but Gave is basically a sacrifice outlet that you can do over and over again. So that's actually not that bad. I'll put it in B tier. Definitely above Coffiner by far. Gave is actually very useful. Here's the thing about Gave, though, and this is why Gave is one of the more popular Abzan commanders. It's because he is the primary commander for Abzcaban's Abzan deck. And with the way he built his deck, he does make use of the persist combo for sure. But he also throws in some of the cards that go with the Undying combo. So Undying is kind of like the other side of the coin for persist. When a creature with Undying dies, it comes back with a +1/+1 counter. The reason that persist is more consistent is because of the counter negation cards that I keep talking about. Yes, technically Undying is affected by Solemnity, but it's not affected by Vizier of Remedies, it's not affected by Anafenza Kintry, it's not affected by Malira. So there's more to remove -1/-1 counters than there is to remove +1/+1. So Gave works because of that first ability that he has. Remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature you control, create the Sapperling. With that, he in of himself, Gave within of himself, is the one that negates the Undying counters. So in the Undying combo, he's the counter negator. In the Persist combo, he is the sacrifice outlet. So very useful. It does have a place not only just as a commander, but you could even run him in this deck and it would be viable enough. Just nowhere near the levels of Nethroi and Offenza. Like, there's a whole tier I'm putting above them between the two. But with Abscommand's deck, it's a Gave deck. Like, you can't do what I'm doing right now. You can't just say, I'm going to take Abscommand's list, and instead of running Gave, I'm going to be running Nethroi. It does not work like that. Gave was chosen as the commander in mind, and the deck is built around him, as opposed to the commander just kind of sliding into the deck. So Gave, even though I understand he's very popular, even if we look at Abzan commanders by popularity, he is, there are almost 200 more decks made about Gave than there are of Nethroi. And you could argue that, Gave's been around longer, so of course there are. But I think Carador has been around longer, or about as long as Gave has. But Gave has 300 more decks dedicated to him over Carador. So at the end of the day, like, Gave is by far like one of the most popular Abzan commanders, and I think Abzcaban's deck did contribute to that. But to be fair, we're not talking about Abzcaban's deck. We're not talking about a Gave deck. So Gave, useful, but we can do better. Dagadar the Adamant, A tier. This one is funny. So the reason that Dagger, I'm putting him in A tier. I run him. He's the third most common, commander that I'm using for this deck behind Nethroy and Anafenza. Because Dagger is incredibly underwhelming. I would say he does almost as much as Gave does. So what he does is he's Vigilance, nobody cares. He is 3 mana and 1 white for the commanding cost, and he enters the battlefield with 4+1/+1 counters on it. So 4 mana for a 4/4, okay, not bad. Then you pay 1 colorless Golgari, move a +1/+1 counter from target creature onto a second target creature. So he's nowhere near as efficient as Gave for what he does. It costs more mana to do fundamentally a worse version of what Gave does. So as far as functionality, Gave is much better than Dagger. But because of Gave's popularity, he is a threat. You are not really running a Gave deck without the intent to kill. Chances are, even if you're running a Gave deck, you're going to be running Abzan's deck. I could be wrong. You could build any type of Gave deck you want. That's fine by me. But people are going to look at you, and they're kind of going to get a sense of what you're trying to do. You could say the same thing about Nethroy and Anafenza. Not so much Anafenza. Anafenza is a little bit more of a wild card as to what those types of decks are. I even saw a Anafenza Exile tribal deck, and that came out of left field. Nobody was expecting that. But Anafenza is just a really efficient, powerful card on her own, and then Nethroy is just flat out the best. So even though these two are threats, they back it up really well. Gave is a threat in this deck that is too threatening for what he can contribute. So you're going to be the target. You're already painting a target on your back when you're choosing Gave, and you can't keep up with Gave. He's too slow compared to the other two commanders. Dagger that could go one of two ways. One of three ways. Either other players are very new and they're wondering why you're allowed to play a white creature as your commander for an Abzan deck. It's because of the Golgari mana symbols. He is, by his color identity, he is a white, black, green creature. So it does work as the Abzan commander. Once you get past that level of players, Dagger is either so off the walls out of nowhere that nobody assumes that he's a threat. So they're just kind of gonna let you go until you actually start showing your hands and, okay, it's not a Dagger deck, it's an Abzan combo deck. Or people are going to be going after you because all of a sudden they're afraid of Dagger. And it begs the question, why? Because at the end of it all, Dagger is, they're really only going to be going after you from my experience, after you play a couple of games with Dagger as the commander. At that point, you can switch it out. Not mid-game, obviously, that'd be cheating, but between games, there's, no rules against saying, hey, so before we start this next game, I'm switching out a commander that has the exact same commander or color identity. So, you're really not breaking any of the commander rules there. If you switch it out Dagger into something more powerful, all of a sudden your deck becomes more powerful. But if you leave Dagger there, eventually his irrelevance is going to become so underwhelming again that you do go back to square one, where people are wondering why they're targeting the Dagger deck to begin with, until you actually combo off again and remind them the reason. But I think, again, just because Dagador himself is so off the walls, he is a troll commander. You're playing it for a joke. You're playing it to go under the radar. But when you're a combo deck that also is running powerful cards like Protean Hulk and Demonic Tutor, sometimes you need to go under the radar. You can't do that with Gave. So Dagger, he's probably not going to be. Yeah, well, we'll see. I don't think he's going to be like the top of A tier. I have to go through the other commanders and exactly, kind of figure that out for myself. Um, but for right now, A tier is where I want to put him. Excuse me. So next, Doran the Siege Tower. I'm not putting him in B yet. I'm just want to read what he is. So for green or black, green, white, he is a 0/5. Each creature assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. I'm gonna put that in D tier. He does literally nothing. We're not looking at combat damage. We're looking at abusing the fact that math is amazing and English is a stupid language, just like I said in the deck tech. We're abusing how persist works. And even though it's a creature based combo, you're not going to be swinging in with creatures. You're not assigning combat damage to begin with. So even though Doran doesn't really hurt, because like a persist creature is only going to be a 2/2 or a 1/1, or realistically any creature that you're running is going to have the same power and toughness. But Doran doesn't, like again, just by the sole fact that you're not running combat damage, Doran does absolutely nothing. So D tier, very very useless. At least with Kolfner, he does something. So let's read Carador next. Carador costs one less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. Okay, so as you get hated out of the game just by playing your creatures, assuming you're playing your creatures, Carador is going to cost less to cast. During each of your turns, you may cast one creature card from your graveyard. Okay, so actually, I kind of like where I just accidentally put him to read him. I would say he's B tier. I don't think he's as strong as Gave for this deck. But the reason he is stronger than Kolfner is that he kind of does basically the same thing that Kolfner does, except for one, I still think even despite the fact that Carador does cost 2 more as far as the converted mana cost, if you're getting to the point where creatures are filling in your graveyard because of being hated out of the game, Carador is probably going to cost less than Kolfner. So you're going to be getting him out more consistently compared to Kolfner. So for one thing, I'm just going to say, practically speaking, Carador costs less mana. And then during each of your turns, you may cast one creature card from your graveyard. So if a particular piece does get hated out of the game and is killed and sent to the graveyard, you can recast that piece on the next turn. And then you still have the option of playing one or two creatures from your hand in order to get that difference. So essentially, I would say that Carador is a nice example of card advantage there, because now you don't just have to rely on what's in your hand, you also have the option of what's in your graveyard to, a decent extent. It's kind of unfortunate that Carador can only bring back creatures. Like I get it as far as flavor and balance, and I'm not arguing against that, but just beware that Carador cannot bring back an Altar of Dementia. or a blasting station or a solemnity. So if anything like that gets hated out of the game and you're missing, your sacrifice outlet or your counter negators, and those were already blown up by, I don't know, a putrefy or a mortify or something like that, then you're kind of out of luck on that one. And it's just unfortunate that that's how the game went. But it's okay because the majority of the combo pieces in this deck are still creatures. So I think you're still going to be getting quite a bit of value out of Carador. I will say that with Carador, and I mean, I've already mentioned this, and I think that this same thing applies to Doran as well. With Carador, he can be an absolute amazing commander if you build the deck around him. I don't. Carador is one of those commanders where you'd put Spore Frog in the deck. The Spore Frog is basically a fog effect if you sacrifice it, and it's on a creature. So Carador can keep bringing Spore Frog back, and you essentially have a Turbo Fog deck as you need it. So that's an example. Like, I would never put Spore Frog in this Abzan combo deck that I'm running because it just doesn't do anything helpful or effective. It doesn't have persist. It's not a sacrifice outlet. It can only sacrifice itself. So it's a completely useless card for my deck. But in a Carador deck, it could be absolutely fantastic. So none of these commanders, maybe except for Daggeter, but I troll pick him anyway, so it doesn't matter. None of these commanders are bad on their own right. They just need decks built around them, and Carador is definitely one of those commanders. But he does have merit in this deck, and if you do, if Nethroi is too expensive and it's really hard to find an Anafenza, but from way back in the day you have a Carador lying around, you can put Carador in the deck and still do just fine. There's absolutely no shame in running Carador. Let's see, Cathro. Oh yeah, this guy, D tier. Easily the absolute worst commander that you could possibly run. I just went on this whole spiel about building around the commander. Cathril is the textbook definition of that. Cathril says a lot of things. He's a 3/3 for 5 mana, which doesn't sound that great, but it says when Cathril enters the battlefield, you may put a flying counter on. I can't exactly read that. Hold on. When Cathril Aspect Warper enters the battlefield, put a flying counter on any creature you control. If a creature card in your graveyard has flying, repeat this process for first strike, double strike, death touch, hexproof, indestructible, lifelink, menace, reach, trample, and vigilance. Then put a +1/+1 counter on Cathril for each counter you put on a creature this way. So basically, Cathril is like a Voltron player's dream, especially when it comes to Abzan, because you're going to be like Cathril is like the keyword soup, the alphabet soup commander. You're filling your deck with a bunch of creatures that have very specific keywords on them, none of which are persist, by the way. Cathril has nothing to do with persist. I just read off a whole bunch of keywords and none of them were persist. Cathril, honestly, I would love to build a Cathril deck. I might end up building a Cathril deck down the road, because outside of, being a degenerate combo player, I do really like Voltron, and Cathril is right up there when it comes to Voltron. But the point of Cathril is you're putting very specific creature cards in your graveyard. You're trying to keep them in your graveyard as opposed to having them returned from the battlefield. So that way you can rely on the keywords to make Cathril potentially the single creature that has first strike, double strike, death touch, yada 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 yada, and vigilance, and then putting that many +1/+1 counters on him. So Cathril in when you get the god tier draws, and by turn 4 Cathril comes in as an 8/8 with like 5 keywords on him, that's a threat, and that is a very good deck when it will work. This is not one of those decks. As a matter of fact, when it comes to this, I would arguably even say Cathril does less than Doran, because Doran, if you're going into combat, Doran is a 3-mana 5/5. Cathril, because I don't think there are too many relevant keywords in my deck. Like, I don't know how many creatures have reach. I don't remember how many exactly have vigilance. So fundamentally, Cathril is just going to be a 5-mana 3/3. That's bad. That's really bad compared to Doran. So even when I say Doran does absolutely nothing for the deck, Cathril does it worse. Even though I love Cathril and I think he's a great Abzan commander overall, it's just no. So let's see. Kethis the Hidden Hand. Legendary spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Exile 2 legendary cards from your graveyard. Until end of turn, each legendary card in your graveyard gains. You may play this card from your graveyard. So Kethis, again, I think he's a little bit more of a fun commander. Again, this is another one of those Abzan commanders. He's going in D tier, by the way. I think I'm going to put him in between, because in all absolute fairness, for one thing, he does cost only 3 mana as opposed to the 5 that Cathril does. And Kethis says legendary spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Okay, so I'm actually putting Kethis just above Doran. Can I do that? Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so Kethis can, while Doran's doing absolutely nothing, Kethis is at least making, what's her name? Malira. He's at least making Malira cost less. I know that's terrible to say that, literally the only edge that Kethris has on Doran is that in the absolute fringe scenario, Kethis can make you combo off a turn earlier because Malira doesn't cost as much. You're saving 1 mana, therefore 1 land, therefore 1 turn. I don't think it's worth it. That's why I'm putting him in D tier. I will definitely sooner run Kolfner over Kethris. But you know what? I'm sorry. I talked about it. I gave my reasoning. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Let's go into something a little bit more fun. So, Tayam Luminous Enigma. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional vigilance counter on it. Pay 3 generic, remove 3 counters from among creatures you control, put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, then return a permanent card with converted mana costs 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So I want to put him... So he's definitely going above Carador, because, for one thing, Tayam does cost only 4 mana. And that's a lot cheaper than Carador. So, I mean, we're getting that part out of the way. He's half the cost for a very interesting effect, because pretty much here's how this would work. As long as you have the mana for it, you can. Sorry, I haven't thought too much about time. I don't know exactly how to word it. But basically, so like, let's say that you have a fair amount of mana. Let's use a specific number. Let's use 9 mana. So you have 9 mana. We're also going to assume that you haven't played Time yet. No, that's a bad example. Um, okay, so wow, I'm just butchering this. Um, let's say that other than Time, so 9 plus 4 is 13. Let's say you have 13 mana just because you got all your ramp spells out early. Um, and on the battlefield, you have a sacrifice outlet, so let's just say Viscerous here, and then a persist creature, we'll just say Putrid Goblin. What you'll do is you'll play Tayam for 4 mana. So you got you got 9 mana left over. Tayam enters. No, each other creature. Sorry. Um, so Tayam doesn't enter. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just really bad at this. Basically, what I'm trying to say. So you have a sacrifice outlet, you have a persist creature, and you have Tayam. Without anything else that negates the counters, you sacrifice the persist creature. It'll come back with a -1/-1 counter on it and a vigilance counter on it. If you are able to get a third counter from anywhere, maybe you're playing another creature, or maybe you play Tayam one turn and then the sacrifice outlet and the persist creature on a different turn. But you don't have anything else really. Like, you have some cards in your hand, but whatever. But you still have the mana for it. You pay 3. You remove the vigilance counter from the sacrifice outlet. You remove the vigilance counter from the persist creature, and then you remove the -1/-1 counter from it. You'll activate Tyrum's ability, put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, then return a permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Our deck is very low CMC, so most of our creatures that are required for the combo, and even some other pieces like Blasting Station is 3 mana or less. Solemnity is 3 mana or less. Wing Rattle Scarecrow is 3 mana or less. So you return that permanent card from the graveyard to the battlefield. It'll enter the battlefield with another vigilance trigger because of Tayam. Then the persist creature will die. Because it didn't have the -1/-1 counter on it, it will come back with a -1/-1 counter on it, but then it will also come back with a vigilance counter on it because of Tayam's ability. So now you got, for 3 mana, you got a creature card out of your graveyard and back onto the battlefield, but now you're in the exact same position as far as the number of counters you have to repeat that process with Tayam as the commander. Granted, you're limited by the fact that you can only have 3 mana for doing this. And if you ever get another creature that prevents your persist creature from having -1/-1 counters on it, then this strategy does not work. Having the -1/-1 counter creature being returned to the battlefield is kind of like what your next step would be. But then I also just realized Tayam himself is completely shut down by Solemnity. Okay, so yeah, I think I'm going to put Tayam right where I have him right now. I don't think he's effective as Gave. I think Gave does what Tayam is trying to do, except better for our purposes. Granted, Well, no, they're a little bit different. Tayam actually gets cards from the graveyard back onto the battlefield, and I think he can do it much more efficiently than Carador can, because for one thing, Tayam does come out earlier, and then if you have the mana for it, Tayam can do that multiple times in a turn. So Tayam is more efficient than Carador, but for the purposes of using anything, he is less, or she, I don't know, is less efficient than Gave. So yeah, I think even though we're splitting hairs at this point, Tayam is not as good as Gave, but is better than Carador. And then Teneb the Harvester. Um, this is an interesting one. I think so here's what I'm thinking right now, right? So Teneb is a 6 mana commander for a 6/6 with flying. The fact that it is a 6/6 with flying, if you're desperate, if you get hate bared out of the game, or there's that one piece that prevents you from doing your combo loop at all, and you're just kind of out of luck on that one, at least with Teneb, Teneb is the most formidable combat creature for a commander that you could have, because it has built-in evasion, and the power and toughness are pretty high and very fair for the mana cost that you're actually paying. He does what Carador does, except worse, because you have to tack in with Teneb. Your opponent cannot have any blockers whatsoever. They can't have anything with reach. They can't have anything with flying. Which I honestly like. I haven't run Teneb very much. I've only run him like 1 or 2 games, and even then, I haven't even cast him. I lost one and then one through combo on the other. Um, so the appeal of Teneb should be that, when X happens, you may pay 2 generic and a black. If you do, put target creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. That is a worse Carador, because it's very rare that we're going to be having creatures that cost 3 or more for our intents and purposes. Like with Carador, let's say with Carador, we're trying to get back Putrid Goblin, or with either of them, we're trying to get back Putrid Goblin. In Carador's case, as long as he's on the battlefield, which we have to assume that for this, you're only paying 1 generic and 1 black just to get Putrid Goblin back on the battlefield. With Teneb, you must pay 2 generic and a black for the exact same effect. So you're paying 1 generic mana more in order to do that. And in order for that to actually work, Teneb has to deal combat damage to an opponent. Now, granted, in multiplayer Commander, you can just find the weakest link. Like, between 3 opponents that you have, if you're playing a 4-player game, the odds of finding somebody that you can attack into are going to be very high. So I'm going to say fundamentally the conditions that Teneb needs to meet are fairly non-existent, which means that Carador, you could just cast a creature for its mana cost. Teneb, you generally will have to pay more mana after a pre-combat or during a post-combat main phase. Yeah, sorry. During a post-combat main phase is the only time that you can really make this work. So fundamentally it should be a worse Carador, but because it costs a little bit less mana for it and it is a fighter. Actually, what I think I'm going to do, I'm going to put Teneb in A tier above Dagger. And here's why. So the reason he's above Dagger is because Dagger is a troll. We've mentioned that. He's a viable troll because he's very underwhelming, but he's still a troll. The reason I'm putting Teneb as high as I am is because he is a plan B. With Carador, Tyam, Gave, and even Nethroi, their benefits to the deck are fail-safes for when you're suffering from targeted removal or board wipes. And like, I get it. Those are common enough that those are threats that you do have to be concerned about. Like, I get it. That makes total sense. But if you're ever up against a threat that will otherwise shut down your combo, you have nothing. You are basically a worse token deck because, I mean, sure, you're getting like 2/2 creatures that could still be 1/1 creatures or whatever, but at least with token decks, they're pumping out tokens left and right, like Lingering Souls. Was that, I think it's 2 generic and a white for a sorcery to create 2 1/1 spirit tokens with flying, but then it has flashback for 1 and a black. Incredibly good card as far as card advantage goes. So for 1 card, you're getting like 4 spirits, and you're exiling the card from your graveyard, but like 4 spirits off of 1 card, and you could even do that in 1 turn if you have the mana for it. You're not really getting that kind of value with your persist creatures and your combo negators and even like your Zulaport Cutthroat and Cruel Celebrant. If you have a way to just make the combo irrelevant and all you have is small bodies, you're out of luck. At least with Teneb, for 6 mana, which is a fair cost for this, you're getting a flying 6/6. Okay, let's put it this way. I think that I would be willing to put Teneb in, the 3rd rank of S tier if he was a 7/7 for 6 mana, because then and like, I know they can't because of it's the rules for the Elder Dragons, and I don't care. But at least with Teneb, if you have to win through commander combat damage, you can. It's going to take you a few turns. It will take you single-handedly 4 turns to kill 1 opponent. But it is something that can be done because he's a flying 6/6. He is a more viable combatant than Anafenza, who really, to be fair, is just a 4/4 without flying. So yeah, the fact that Teneb is a better fighter than the other commanders, I'd be willing to put him here. I should really be running Teneb more, I think, is the final verdict. But yeah, speaking of final verdicts, we went over every Abzan commander that is not a partner pairing and has been released so far. Went over the rankings, why I put them where I have. I'm gonna stick with this. So yeah, at the end of the day, if you are trying to make the most out of this deck, go Nethroi. If you feel you need to, go Anafenza. If you feel you need to, go Teneb. If you feel funny today, go Dagger. I would avoid these other seven. I don't think they're worth it enough, especially when you have four commanders to choose from to begin with. So yeah, final verdict. Let me know if you guys agree or disagree. I am definitely open to hearing different opinions on this. If you think that maybe I was too harsh on Gave or Catherall, or if I'm putting Dagger in too high of a pedestal, there's definitely an argument for that, and I would love to hear it. So leave comments below. Like the video if you agree. Please don't dislike if you disagree. Just leave a comment. But otherwise, yeah, hopefully, if you're a little bit confused as to which commander to use for this type of deck, hopefully this puts things into perspective. It will help you step up the game a little bit for it. And otherwise, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.